season. And we are going to have 6 seminars. The last one is on June 23rd. So today is our first seminar of the season, and it's a very well attended one, so I'm happy to see a good turnout. Now, it is very important that everybody attending signs the attendance book, because that's how we get our funding for these events. So if you haven't signed, please do so. And also, I have copies of the chapter newsletter. This is available in electronic form. It is posted to the chapter website, www.easttoronto.peo.on.ca. There is a tab there that says newsletter, and you can see it in electronic form. Somebody wants to have a paper copy of it, feel free to pick up one at the registration table. We also have some attendance certificates for anyone who is interested to have one. Again, on your way out, feel free to pick up one of those. I will sign them during the presentation. Now, I would like to introduce the East Toronto chapter board members in attendance tonight. It's Arthur Sinclair, our vice chair, Robert Lee, treasurer, Dan Mireno, webmaster. Oh, sorry, secretary. Until recently, he was our webmaster. Now, James Tate, our new webmaster, yeah, and John Bales, events committee, and David Zacon, events committee. I believe I'm not missing anybody, so now, without further ado, I would like to introduce the speaker for tonight. It's Richie Luca. He comes a PNG. He comes to share his wealth of knowledge on transportation, and this is a very relevant subject for most people, and particularly for engineers. So let's give a warm welcome to Richie.
Great, thank you, Hugo. So good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining me tonight. As Hugo said, my name is Rishi. I'll get it a little bit more of a detailed introduction in a few slides here, but the focus tonight is really a general introduction to transit planning and analysis, obviously focusing a little bit on Toronto specifically. So in terms of the... Okay, so in terms of the agenda, I guess if people who know me in the room know I could probably talk about this stuff for a very long time, but I've tried to break it down and tell a little bit of a story. So at a high level, we start with some of the basics about planning and engineering. A lot of the time, those terms in transportation and consultancy sometimes get interchanged a little bit, but I'll probably use them, like I said, intermixed, so just bear with me. We'll focus a little bit on the Golden Horseshoe, so not just Toronto, but the entire area that kind of links the region together, the economic region. Talk a little bit about economics and finance. I think there is an abundance of discussion where we draw lines on maps and we have these grand ideas and plans, but as technical people, we operate within constraints. And we have specifications and requirements to meet. So I think we all have a lot of great ideas on what the ideal solution would be, but I do spend a few slides on that just to bring a little bit of, to ground the conversation a little bit. The next thing I should say is talk a little bit about operations and maintenance. So we tend to focus a lot on what is the next new line, the new technology, who's going to get what, where, and when. That's a 5 to 10 year solution. So the system is already bursting at the seams. There's a lot of other alternatives and options that we can explore before then. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. I'm going to tentatively say we'll have a break. I guess I've done this talk a few times and they range in time, so I guess maybe I'll do a time check when we get to that point, and maybe if we take a 5 or 10 minutes to get everybody a chance to stretch their legs or use facilities and whatnot. And again, we'll proceed through. So on we go. So again, the high-level goals is to give you a summary, an introduction to planning concepts. The next stage is really to make sure that you have an idea, what questions should you be asking the next time you read a news story or a proposal, or I guess there's one of those every day, but at least you'll be thinking about some of the things that we think about. And the last part is hopefully I can inspire some of you to become a little bit more of a vocal person in the ongoing dialogue. Not only, I guess, attending public meetings and events, but with your family and friends. It's kind of a very, very critical time for the region, and I guess what we end up doing for our transportation system and transit, which is kind of my focus area in the next 5 or 10 years, will really kind of make or break the next generation for us here in Toronto. So just a short bit about me. I grew up in Oakville, Ontario. I've lived and worked in a few places in Canada, the US, and the UK. I was always kind of a quiet, nerdy kid who liked Lego and SimCity and programming. When it came time to applying, this was, I guess, about the turn of the century, so the internet was becoming a big thing, and I remember a lot of interesting conversations with my parents between should I go the kind of computer systems engineering route or the civil engineering route. I was a decent programmer. I did like computers, so I kind of went that way for a little bit. I did my bachelor's degree in systems design engineering at Waterloo. I also did an arts degree just to kind of branch out. I enjoyed some of the, I guess, topics of economics and psychology and a few other things like that, poli-science as well. So have a little bit of a mixed background. Once I graduated, I had a couple of years working as a software developer and support. I spent 5 years in Alberta doing test measurement and automation field engineering, so that's really where my PEng expertise comes in. And then 2 years after that, when I moved back to Ontario, I was more at the business development strategic side of thinking at a small consulting company. So that isn't really related to transportation, but I wanted to give you context. Today, over the last 3 years, I've been kind of self-teaching myself a little bit about planning and attending events and meetings like this, the ones put on by the city, reading all sorts of blogs, and I made a decision about a year and a bit ago that while I was spending probably 15 to 20 hours a week of my personal time learning about this stuff, so maybe I should try to get paid to do it somehow. So I have a very supportive wife who let me quit my job. I enrolled at Ryerson for full-time civil engineering, and so this is just kind of a subset of some of the courses that I've done, and I will be starting a job as a transportation planner and engineer at the end of April. So kind of shifting gears, shifting career paths, but I'm really happy doing this, so hopefully I can pass on some of the things that I've learned. So why do I like transportation planning? Well, it's an interesting combination because it brings into account not only the technical and the engineering skill set, but it brings into account urban design, land use, a little bit of sociology and psychology because it is very behavioral. Beyond that, there is the economics part of it, and then finally public health and political science. It's kind of a very multidisciplinary topic. I am going to focus primarily on some of the technical stuff today, but there is a lot of, I guess, other related components. So just in general, this slide deck, I've done this presentation I think 4 or 5 times now. Like I said, it kind of tells a full story and gives the picture of where we're at and kind of where we're going. It's really a hobby of mine, I should say. So first of all, I will say that the majority of the materials are references that I have taken and obtained. So all the references you'll see will be in the bottom right corner of the slides, and there'll be a few that I've done myself as well. But a lot of this stuff is all publicly available at a lot of events. A lot of experts have provide a lot of commentary online as well. So you can really obtain a lot of this knowledge, I guess, in your free time as well, like I did, if you'd like. So the last piece I will mention is that these are obviously, some of these things will be my opinions or my understanding of where we're at right now. So it's not a formal professional recommendation on anything, but I guess I'm like an amateur intermediate at this point. I'm learning as I go, so I'm very much open to any other ideas that you have. If you have suggestions or critiques for me by the end of it, I'm wide open and available to that as well. So I hope you enjoy. So moving on to the introduction. So overall, when we think of transportation and transportation planning, we tend to focus more so on the network and what's being built next. But there's a very symbiotic relationship between the transportation system itself, so that's in green, and the urban activity system. What that really means is what we do day to day here in the city. So that includes land development, where we choose to live, where we choose to work, where we choose to play, where we choose to go shopping. In addition to that, what time of day we do that at. Some of us have, I guess, the more typical 9-to-5 job where some of our non-work activities are limited to the evening. That's probably the majority of people, and then the weekend as well. Others of us have a little bit more flexibility. And then finally, there's some patterns to that. Like I just said, it really is dependent upon our schedules. The picture on the right here is just kind of flipping this on the side where there are short-term decisions and travel decisions that we're doing. So, we mentioned about activity and, when there is demand on the network, when people are using the roads in transit. And there's kind of more long-run and long-term thinking that's involved in terms of land use, where people choose to settle permanently. Do I want to buy a car? Which car? Et cetera, and then finally the network itself. So again, it's kind of the same blocks on both sides, but just kind of grouping it slightly differently to get you to think about it. So the other part of it is this idea of spatial structure and transportation. So I touched on that a lot, but what this graph really is showing is that it gives you an idea of kind of urban density and the amount of energy used kind of per year per capita. So you get the typical, I guess what you might assume, the U.S. kind of mindset on the top left corner. You have the European style of planning in the middle here. Toronto kind of sits in between the two, along with Australian cities. And then as you go down the curve, you get into the really super mega dense cities like Tokyo, Moscow, and Hong Kong. So overall, how do planners kind of think through all this? So in terms of how do we decide who's going to use what roads or what lines or what's routes? There's an old model called a 4-step travel demand model that we tend to follow. You start kind of with trip generation, so where do people live, when do they need to go places. The trip distribution step is where work and retail is located, so kind of how they disperse over the city. So some of you will go from downtown out to the inner and the outer suburbs, some of you go from the outside in, and some of you will do something completely different. So we take that into account in terms of where you want to go and where you're coming from. The next piece is the modal split. So there's obviously a lot of options when it comes to which technology and which mode you use. Do you choose to bike? Do you walk? Do you take transit and the various modes within that? And then finally, do you choose to drive? And then finally, we actually assign people onto different routes. So again, the idea is that there is a general equilibrium that occurs. So if a road is very, very, very full all the time in the morning, I'm sure a lot of you have done this. You might try to experiment once in a while. You'll find a slightly better road or a route that you think is better, and you'll follow that way until you don't like it, and then that kind of naturally occurs. It's not perfect, but that's kind of how we disperse ourselves. I guess the photo on the left there is bringing into account some of the higher level things we talked about in terms of the city. So the network itself, the activity, the system, and kind of where people choose to locate. So one really critical concept is this concept of induced demand. And so the first thing I will say is I know congestion is very frustrating, but it's actually not a bad thing. We could really have worse problems. Congestion is a sign of a very, very healthy city where people do move around and they want to move around and people want to live there. We could have the opposite problem where they have in many, 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 many U.S. cities where they can't get enough people to, travel to certain places. The downtowns are basically hollow in the evenings, not on the weekends. So that's an important point to know. The point of induced demand is we can't actually just build our way out of it. And I'm going to give you an example about that in a minute. But the idea is that transportation systems are dynamic in nature. So if we were to add, for example, an extra lane on the DVP or the 404, for the existing demand today, yes, there would be excess capacity. But once you add that extra lane, before you add that extra lane, there are people who are choosing not to travel on the DVP and the 404 because it's so busy. Or they're choosing to travel at times of day when it isn't busy. Or they're choosing to live closer to where they're going, etc. If you add that extra lane, yes, for the existing demand, there's capacity, but that now encourages people who live farther to change their travel patterns to use up that supply. So the graph on the right kind of shows that by limiting the supply, you kind of also limit the demand in some way as well. So Similarly, if you build a lot of extra transit and you move people off the roads, the people, let's say, that might be up in Newmarket or Aurora or Vaughan, who weren't driving before or weren't driving at those times, will also migrate to those to use up that supply. So it's a really important concept. Now, the only way that you can actually reduce congestion is something that we all hate, which is behavioral pricing and incentives. So if you increase the gas tax, if you tolled the roads, or if you really change the cost of driving to what it actually costs society, which is way more than any of us pay in any fees or gas or anything, that is the only way to get out of congestion. So you can look at London, you can look at Stockholm. When they implemented their congestion charges, that's how they reduced traffic in their center cities. So that's really important, and just so keep that in mind when you see all these reports that say we can reduce congestion and all that stuff. What they're really saying is that because the city is projected to grow by X million people, X million trips over the next 10, 15 years, if we build transit now, we'll be able to better take up that additional demand and not get to the really critical point, which is gridlock itself, which means that the network is basically not moving at all. So something that frustrates myself and many, many, many people is we tend to obsess in this region about the technology. And we forget that it's not the technology really, it's the type of service that we want and the spacing between stops. Every single streetcar can go 80 kilometers an hour. Every bus can go 120 kilometers an hour. Every subway car can do the same, so can LRTs. Your car can do that too. But on average, if you have to stop in your car every 100 meters downtown for a stoplight, like it is for a bus stop or a streetcar stop, your average speed is lower. So again, we need to think about and keep in mind that it's the stop spacing that matters. GO trains can go over 100 kilometers an hour, but they have a couple of kilometers between each station, so they can actually comfortably accelerate, reach that cruising speed, and then slow down before you hit the next station without knocking passengers off their feet. Similarly, if you look at the TTC network, different parts of the subway system operate at different speeds. If you're on the Yonge line, going towards North York and North Toronto, the stops are more 1-2 kilometers apart. So you can get up to that 60 or 70 kilometer an hour speed. That's the only place on the system the subway cars get that fast. The only place. So it doesn't matter if the new vehicle is 100 or 80 kilometers an hour, it can never reach that speed because of how we design the services in the system. So the key thing to remember is, are we designing a regional line? Are we designing a local line? Or are we designing a hybrid line? And that's what really matters. After that, we figure out what the technology is. We have to decide this first. The other thing, and I'll talk a lot about this later, is that we focus so much on new lines. What's the next new thing? Are they expanding this? Are they building this additional capacity, etc.? But we forget that there are a lot of different options available to improving the quality and basically the service that we have today. So this came out of Metrolinx's relief line consultations last year. Obviously that by itself is a very controversial project, so I won't bring that up for now. But the idea is that beyond everything in orange, which is new infrastructure, which is 5 to 10 years away at minimum, what can we do today to better make use of the infrastructure that we have? So I will focus a little bit at the early stage on the gray and the blue, which is policy and improvements in the operating side that we can actually get better capacity out of our existing system. So last thing is, how do we actually evaluate different ideas? So this is I guess an excerpt from the model that Metrolinx is moving towards, and it's based on a framework they use in the UK called WebTag. And the idea is that every single option will be evaluated strategically from a policy and a planning point of view. The economic and financial realities, essentially. So obviously different modes, different shapes, different technologies will change development. It'll change behavior in its own ways. We want to evaluate that. And the last piece is the deliverability and the operational analysis. So this is going one step beyond their benefits case analyses that they've been talking about for the last 5 to 10 years or so. which focused more on an accounting side of things and was just the raw numbers itself. This brings into account the strategic and the actual constructability limitations as well. So what you will see over the next, definitely by the end of this year, and you will definitely see this in the next 5 years for all infrastructure in Ontario, is this type of framework, is a business case for everything. We have trade-offs to make, that's a reality, and so what is the best way of evaluating these different components? So with that kind of high-level concepts in mind, we're going to move on to details about the Golden Horseshoe. So the Golden Horseshoe, I kind of go beyond Toronto. That includes the Toronto metropolitan area, which kind of goes over to Oakville and out to Pickering, north up through about Newmarket. The Oshawa metropolitan area, which is everything east and north of there, and then west, including Whitby and Ajax. And then the Hamilton area, which is you have your kind of Milton, Burlington, St. Catharines, Stony Creek, etc. So that in and of itself, we just passed 6.5 million people. So we are projected to grow by another 10 million, to 10 million and beyond over the next 20 to 25 years. So that's another 3 to 3.5 million people that are going to move to our region. Or I guess the birth rate will change, all these sorts of things beyond any kind of special programs or incentives. The key to remember that is 20% of Canada's population. It's also 20% of Canada's GDP. So when they say that this region is the most stable and economic powerhouse of the country, they really mean it, and the proof is there. So it's really important for us to think about how we move within the region. Now, if you're wondering about the colors on here, I'm a little bit colorblind, so I'm going to point. This is protected farmland. Lighter or duller gray is the green belt, which includes the Oak Ridges Moraine and the Niagara Escarpment area. You have the gray area, which is the built-up area today, and you have these pockets here, which is the remaining space that we've set aside to be developed. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is the amount of land that's available within the Greenbelt Act is 3 times the size of Mississauga. Okay, so we hear a lot about the Greenbelt is driving up prices and it's ruining our city and things like that. There's an exorbitant amount of land that is available still. And the second part I will say is that because of densification and kind of a natural tendency with what's happening in the city, we probably won't use or even need to use all that up. So now, just a little bit about you. So out of everybody who's here, who regularly drives to work? Okay. And who, I'm going to remember to do this, who takes transit to work? Wow, okay, more than normal. Who bikes to work? All right, and who's lucky enough to walk to work? All right, okay, that's good to know.
How about work?
Sure, work. Well, I guess that's kind of walking to work, right?
Downstairs. Roll to work.
So this is from the City of Toronto's Feeling Congested campaign, and it gives you a good breakdown in terms of how the different parts of the GTA travel differently. So that is for a lot of different reasons. A lot of it has to do with land use and where the jobs are actually located. I'll show you a map later of how these kind of the office centers and the employment areas kind of end up clustering. But the idea is that we do travel differently throughout the region, so the needs are very different. Even within Toronto, it's one of the things that we struggle with is that in Toronto, unlike most cities, we have the core city, the inner suburbs, and the outer suburbs all within our city limits. So you're having to balance very, very, very different perspectives and points of view on where I want to live. So the outer suburbs tend to have a lot more in common with Durham and York and Peel and Halton regions. The inner suburb is kind of your typical inner city that I guess we're kind of part of here in East York. And then downtown, I think everybody's very familiar with. So where do we get planning data from? We get it from a Transportation Tomorrow survey. So that's a survey that was started in the 80s approximately, commissioned between the MTO and the University of Toronto runs it. It happens every 5 years or so, and it's a very comprehensive study that I believe they get about 20,000 samples across this entire region. So the Golden Horseshoe is split up into 2,000 different planning zones and regions. They get a complete I guess, coverage across that for their survey, and this helps answer questions like, you know, where do you live, where do you work, where do you shop, what modes of transit do you take, what time of day, in terms of transit itself, what routes do you take, GO, do you take TTC, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's a really good survey. What was once known as the census was a really good source of data, and people in our profession are pretty unhappy with the very limited state that it's in right now, and I will leave my comments at that. Beyond that, we have ridership counts, so there is some automated and manual counting itself that happens on board some vehicles. Beyond that, in terms of the real estate side of things and the development industry, there is some good information available from the Toronto Real Estate Board, Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation, the MTO, and there are kind of surveys that are just done that are kind of your random, I guess, what are some of the, you know, I guess when you, during elections, you get those political polls and surveys. It's the same idea. We do the same thing. So that gives you an idea of kind of where the information and data comes from. So with all that context in mind, there's the Places to Grow Act that was passed in 2006. Now what that has done is, in order to make our region move more effectively and efficiently and make commutes for everybody, whether it be for work or for shopping, shorter for everybody, the Ontario government has outlined and defined a set of urban growth centers. So the idea is, in short, is they want to develop a mini downtown where all those dots are around the region. So the point of that is that by doing that, you're looking at improving transportation in the area, you're improving zoning in the area, and that will basically naturally draw employment and higher order retail to the area. So what you can see here, this hasn't been updated since 2006, but what it's showing is, the graph on the left hasn't been updated since 2011, but what they have done is, depending on how, I guess, the size of the urban growth center, so you have the very, very outer suburbs, Kitchener-Waterloo, Peterborough, St. Catharines, Barrie, the Hamilton, Oakville, Vaughan, etc. of the world, Brampton, and then the Toronto centers. They've set density targets for both employment and residential. I guess, again, there's a little bit of controversy about this because I think out of the entire region, I think only 3 or 4 of them have actually met their targets as of 2011. But there's good sentiment here in that, you know, they want to make sure that there is employment available for everybody, everywhere, and shorten all of our trips. So why are we here today? We're really here because what I guess Mr. Byford and others have called the triple whammy. So most people don't believe it, and some of you might remember, but Toronto was actually world-renowned for its transit system in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. We built the young subway when Toronto had 1 million people in the 50s. So we were lauded everywhere for building a subway in a city with such a small population. You got to remember, at those times, and I've seen photos of this, the 401 was in a field. It wasn't even completed. Like the outer suburbs didn't exist. But we have progressed to a point, and then we hit the 80s, and we just kind of stopped building. And if you're very interested in, I guess, the century of plans, progress, politics, and paralysis, I would really urge you to, I guess, have a look at Ed Levy's book, which is online right now, but we will be releasing in the next 6 months. He's been in this space as a well-known transportation engineer for a long time, and you may have heard his name. But anyways, he is an expert in this area, and he's collected a really good, I guess, history book as to how we are here today. So what we've been doing since then in the 80s is that because in the 50s and 60s, we built a lot of infrastructure, we planned into the future, we have basically been using up and passing the buck forward to say that, okay, we have a little bit of supply left, let's just use what we have before. So we're kind of kicking the can down the road. And what's interesting is that you can imagine that in the 50s and 60s, they built so much that we were able to get to this point. Now, we've kind of passed this inflection point in many metropolitan regions where you get to the 3 to 6 million mark, where you need a lot of additional services and infrastructure to make a region like this competitive and work. So that's kind of why we're here today. So what is that triple whammy? Well, first of all, a lot of that infrastructure from the 50s and 60s it needs to be replaced or rehabilitated. So there's a lot of state of good repair that comes once every 2 or 3 generations. That it's our turn, I guess we have to deal with that. The second is pent-up demand. So we have been supply constrained for a long time in this region, and there's a lot of people that would use more infrastructure if we just built it. The last thing is planning for growth. What are we going to do about the 3 or 4 million people who are moving here in the next 20 to 30 years? The last thing I'll say is I get these questions all the time. Why can't we have a subway system like New York and London and Paris and
Montreal.
even Montreal will go with that. Well, the golden era of subway building was the late 1800s, early 1900s, before the automobile existed as a realistic and cheap option, really pre-World War II. So if you look at those populations in 1900, the reason that New York City had like a dozen subway lines in Paris and London at that time is they basically dwarfed us in terms of population. So we've only started hitting those numbers now 100 years later. So you can't fully blame us not having the political courage and will. We're only getting to that inflection point now, and the Toronto area is booming quite a bit, so it's time to catch up. The other thing is we're seeing is a kind of a city revolution. So I had a slide earlier, and I mean the point of this really is saying is that the mindset, especially for people in my generation, all of this is changing. We want to live and work close to each other. The idea of the suburban dream doesn't have the same weight as it does in our generation as it once did. There are now a lot more options available for everybody, and you're free to choose whatever you like. So the idea really is that there is a return to the core happening, and then beyond that, a lot of, I think in the last couple of years, the first time in history that more people have lived in cities than they do live rurally. So it's something that we have to think about. The last thing I will say is that it's no longer states and provinces and countries that are competing for the best talent and the jobs. It's city regions. So we're not necessarily competing with the U.S. Toronto is competing with other knowledge-based industries and cities worldwide. So the last thing is governance. It is a very complicated environment. So there is definitely work that has to be done in terms of the structure of this. You have the federal government, which isn't really involved. At the provincial level, we have a lot of different ministries that have different goals. There's 9 different municipal transit service providers in the GTA, plus Go Transit. They have their own goals. The City of Toronto definitely by itself is a pretty formidable block that we have to consider as well. So governance is really important. We do have to think about that because that keeps this kind of grounded.
Sorry, one quick question
Sure.
about that. Is that unusual?
If you ask me that in 3 weeks, I'm researching that right now.
Okay.
It's tough to say. I mean, transit building is very, by nature, it's a political thing. It's very behavioral. We all care. It impacts us day to day. I think the problem here is that we're so far behind and there is no dedicated funding, there is no money available, although I'm going to refute that shortly, that it kind of lends itself to win-lose. So it's really tough.
I could speak for New York. Used to have about 6 or 7 agencies that provided transit, and then there was a consolidation. But you still today in New York City have 3 to 4 to 5 agencies planning highways and transit.
So Metrolinx was created at the idea of doing this. Really, they're a really good advice giver, but their opinion doesn't really hold weight, right? It doesn't really change anything, and they're not really well known. People don't read their reports. I read the reports, but I'm a nerd with this stuff. So I think it's tricky, and I don't know what's going to happen with that. All right, so the economic and financial situation. So how do we pay for the critical infrastructure that we need? So I've already talked about how it's a really challenging and diverse environment. A lot of different social norms are out there, ways that we talk about things. It seems a lot to me like everybody has a great idea, but only if it doesn't impact the services that they use. So, they had a revenue tool conversation last year or 2 years ago, and everybody said, oh yeah, let's do this and this and this and this, but I think if they had asked the question differently to say that, well, what revenue tool impacts you that would you be willing to pay for, you'd see really different results. So I think it's an interesting time. But that's, I guess, some of the fun in being part of a diverse region like this. In terms of how we pay for infrastructure, municipally, property taxes, user fees, and in Toronto we have the municipal land transfer tax. I think most people are familiar with the provincial and federal taxation structure in general, so I'll just move on. So, property taxes. Toronto has by far the lowest property tax rate in Southern Ontario and including Ottawa. Okay, so this is directly, I checked all these numbers, these are all available on their websites. This is the percentage, including the education amount, that goes straight to the province. Now, you might say, Rishi, what about the municipal land transfer tax? People who buy houses pay that. If you got rid of that this year, it will result in a 16% increase in property taxes one time. That puts us at 0.8%, and so we're the second lowest. So, a lot of people don't realize this about Toronto. Now, to be fair, the cost of land is higher in Toronto, right? So our bills are a little bit higher. So if we take into account the relative percentage that we spend on property taxes as a percentage of household income, which takes into account these very high, I guess, the inflation in land that we're seeing, Toronto still does really, really, really well. So again, I want to paint this picture for you. Now beyond that, there's been some narratives in terms of that maybe the property taxes are so low, that's why we're increasing them so rapidly and drastically. Well, if you compare the change in property taxes on a year-to-year basis to inflation that we have been below for a lot of the last 5 years or so, it's technically a property tax cut, right? Because if we're below the rate of inflation, then your dollar's not going as far. So this is from the latest City of Toronto budget. If you're not a homeowner or you're not 100% sure what current value assessment is, at a really, really high level, every few years, every year they evaluate the value of,
On the initials, do you mind explaining what the CVA and MPAC?
Yeah, I'm going to do that right now. So MPAC is the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation, and CVA is Current Value Assessment. So every year they go out, they get an idea of kind of how much the property taxes have changed, how much the property values have changed in the city. So you get an idea from this graph. The dark blue, they've gone up 3%. The dark red, they've gone up around 6 to 7% to 8%. So all the values have pretty much gone up in the city. But when you have a property tax increase, it's revenue neutral. So if the average, let's just say the average is the property values have gone up 5% on average. If your property value only went up 3%, even though there's a property tax increase on the budget, you actually have a decrease occur. So they try to aim for that middle sweet spot on average. So if your home value went up greater than average, then you're going to pay more than the property tax increase. If your home value went up less than the average, then you will pay less than the increase they're suggesting. Again, it's revenue neutral. This is really interesting because it kind of paints a picture of a little bit of the economic segregation that we have in Toronto, and I will come back to that in a little bit. Worldwide cities tax competitiveness. So this is an aggregate score done by KPMG, the top 51. The top 3 are Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal from a tax basis. So again, although there is a certain narrative occurring, we have a very, very competitive environment when it comes to the combination of income tax, sales tax, corporate tax, the MLTT, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of independent studies, in terms of livability, strongest banks, cities of opportunity, the best cities for business investment, most tax competitive cities, Toronto does exceptionally well across the board. Now, we're there right now, but if we don't invest in infrastructure, we're not going to stay there. So we have to think about that. So what about debt servicing and credit rating? Everybody has a different opinion on if you should use debt to finance things or not. In general, we do very well against Canadian cities in terms of how much we spend on or how much total debt that we have, how much we spend on servicing that debt, and what our credit rating is. So maybe Toronto's doing well, but what about Ontario? Again, Ontario, compared to G7 countries and compared to major US states that we always compete with, is the most tax competitive place. So from a manufacturing and corporate income tax point of view, there's your compare versus 2014, Texas, Florida, North Carolina, New York, California, and then business costs compared to the US baseline and select things in the G7.
It's corporate, right?
Corporate, correct. The previous one would kind of take into account some of like the income tax and all that, but I actually have another slide on that. So provincial income tax comparison. So this is actually something put out by some institutes in Alberta, because in Alberta it's a 10% flat rate for provincial income tax. So this kind of shows you, like in Ontario we have the various tiers. We're actually the second most tax competitive, right up to about 120K per year. Now the average family in Ontario makes $70,000 a year. So again, from a family perspective, we're very, very competitive in a very reasonable place to live. Quebec, somebody who's, oh wow, they didn't include Quebec. Quebec is way higher than that, I know that. Again, in terms of public spending, does Ontario have a spending problem? Again, as a share of GDP, we do okay. There's Quebec, yes. So again, I'm flying through the financial stuff because again, I want to paint kind of an overall summary of it so we have that in the back of our minds. Debt to GDP ratio. So this is an area where, yeah, we're starting to creep up a little bit, but we're not that bad, and we're nowhere near places like the US, like in Europe. We hear a lot about Greece and Italy and Spain and Ireland. Their debt to GDP ratios were in excess of 100%. The US is near 91% right now. I think there obviously is a little bit of a push and pull between the federal government and some of the provinces. The federal government's here, which is very similar to the provinces. Now, obviously, the West is doing very well because of their, I guess, wealth of oil-based revenues, but again, paints a picture. Now, one thing I will say is that can't really fairly compare provincially to federally, because in the federal government they have, not the federal government, but there's the Bank of Canada, which can control interest rates so that you could really, they can better adjust for this than the provinces can. We're kind of subject to whatever the federal government and the Bank of Canada decides. Equalization. Ontario is a have-not province, right? Well, we actually pay $14 or $15 billion into equalization, and we get back 11. So are we have-not, or is that a framing problem from a question point of view? So yes, Alberta definitely pays in a lot. Saskatchewan pays in a lot. They get nothing back. But again, it depends how you kind of look into that net difference. The last thing is about federal partnership. This is an organization in Toronto called the Canadian Centre for Economic Analysis. They do a lot of very complex modeling in terms of what is the most ideal thing for the economic health of Canada and the region. They put out a report. Basically what this is showing is that we're at the B point right now where Ontario is putting in about 2 to 2.5% of its GDP in public infrastructure. The federal government with their Canada Builds program is at 0.25% or so. I guess needless to say that it will, I guess when we do have a federal election this year, it'll definitely be a very infrastructure-minded election. And I can assure you that people like Mr. Tory and Mayor Nenshi and some of the other big city mayors are going to be banging this drum pretty loud. I guess for us in the engineering profession, that's not going to necessarily be a bad thing. Finally, gas taxes. So this is a comparison of federal gas taxes against countries around the world. And on the left side, you see the Mexico, US, and Canada. We haven't changed our gas taxing, neither has the US since the early 90s. if I could predict something because of how much gas prices have come down, an argument, frankly, will be made that we have an appetite and room in our budgets for additional gas tax. So I would put money to say that Ontario's gas tax is probably going to go up in the next budget, in the next two budgets. Finally, transportation funding sources. So again, we like to compare ourselves to a lot of different cities, and we talked the last 2 years about revenue tools and how we don't have the appetite for that. But all these cities, including Montreal, they fund transportation, so not just transit, through a variety of different dedicated funding sources. So again, if we want to do comparisons and aspire to be like these other countries or cities, we have to keep that in mind. All right, getting into operations and maintenance. This is kind of one of the bigger parts of it. So why is operations and maintenance important? So if we had infinite money, political will, and said, okay, every project that's on the books go now, there'd be a lot of construction headache, but you're not riding any new lines or any really substantial new lines for 5 to 15 years from now. So we really don't talk about operations and maintenance. I guess the description I've been given is operations and maintenance is not sexy, quote unquote. There's no ribbon cutting for that. That's why it's not a focus. So we'll talk a lot about big new projects. So operations and maintenance is all about making better use with what we have. And so state of good repair is key to reliable service. Now the good thing is, sorry, go ahead.
BRT, bus?
Bus rapid transit, yes. So bus rapid transit, LRT is light rail transit, which is different to streetcars. State of good repair, the really interesting thing is that in terms of Toronto's 10-year capital plan, about 85% is going to be spent on maintenance of the existing roads, highways, and transit system. Again, how do other cities do this? So you see a comparison here. Now this is a couple years old, but it shows you annual transit funding per capita region-wide, and the lighter color is capital and the darker color is operations. So as it is in terms of operations by itself, we're pretty low, considering how good our ridership is, which I will show you momentarily. But we seem to have that balance off, that we want to build all this new stuff, but not really pay to run it properly. So that a big chunk of that is the Toronto-York Spadina subway extension, which is the major one that was undergo there, and the Eglinton Crosstown. Those are two huge projects. And ever growing, as we seem to hear. So the TTC as we see it today, we always look at this. This is our TTC map, right? Just 4 lines. But the TTC has a citywide system map, something that we actually don't talk about enough in terms of how good it is. So there is coverage across the entire city to every corner, every single ward. We'll talk about the quality of service shortly. And then again, downtown. Downtowners actually really do like their streetcars, by the way. Usually the people that don't like streetcars are the people who drive into downtown. We tend to like them. So TTC ridership growth. We're very unique. Like transit agencies worldwide would be jealous of the fact that we have a supply problem, not a demand problem. They're building this big system in LA, and they're worried about how am I going to get enough people to ride these things. In Toronto, we haven't built anything new in a long time, and for basically almost 20 years, we have ridership growth. Now, I know Bob's in the audience, so before then there was a little bit of an up and down with the 90s recession, but in general, we've done very, very, very well from a growth perspective. So we don't necessarily need new lines to grow the ridership and usage. So TTC service stats. So last year there was 535 million rides. About 1.8 million people per day ride the TTC. Gives you an idea of the route breakdown. What most people don't realize is the bus is the most heavily used part of the TTC. And I'm going to show you a breakdown by route, but the surface system is the real gem. That's the real key to our system, and we don't talk about it enough. So out of all transit riders, only 28% of them ride the subways alone, so any 4 of the lines. 40% of riders never ride a subway to get to where they want to go. The off-peak, so times it's not approximately 7 to 9 a.m. and 3:30 to 6 p.m., so that's the peak. The off-peak carries 50% more riders than the peak period does. So people are using it not just for work, heavily. The last thing that we're renowned for is a feeder system. So out of those 141 buses and 11 streetcar routes, only 4 do not touch the subway. Every single one of those is a feeder route that drives people into those high-capacity tubes. So daily ridership by route. So yellow is subway or subway-like technology. Orange is streetcar. And blue is bus. So this is daily ridership. Again, gives you an idea in terms of, maybe where should we be focusing a lot of our efforts on. So King, Spadina, and Queen, there is no service improvements for them in terms of new lines planned anytime soon. Eglinton, the 2 Eglinton buses show up on this list. Jane was on a previous kind of plan, but it's kind of up in limbo right now. Finch is up there. Obviously, we're going to be upgrading Scarborough's rapid transit at some point soon. And the list kind of goes on. But again, it gives you an idea in terms of hierarchy. So how is the TTC funded? So it's funded through user fees, so fares. The city property tax. So Toronto Council gives about $478 million last year, or I guess this upcoming year, to TTC operations and 109 to wheel transit. Part of your provincial gas tax is split about 50-50 towards dedicated to transit. There's a percentage of the provincial gas tax that goes to transit, of which is split 50-50 between operating and capital. There is a percentage of federal gas tax, but honestly I couldn't find the number quickly, so I don't have that exactly. There is a couple of one-time special funding contributions for projects. The real key is that 75.8% of the TTC's costs are labor, so service delivery. Okay?
Unions,
We'll leave it at that.
100 years back.
So, in terms of transit subsidies, we talk about, TTC is a public service. We pay a $3 fare, and the city gives us, this upcoming year will give us 88 cents per one of those rides to subsidize it. So, without the TTC, the city would grind to a halt. So it is a very core essential service. Again, comparing it to cities around the world, the local area, major Canadian cities, TTC is vastly underfunded. Vastly.
If I can give you an opposite perspective, it's also one of the most popular public transit systems in North America. Right recently is the 3rd most popular after, I think, Portland and Vancouver. So there's 2 ways of looking at it.
New York and Mexico City.
No, but ridership versus, I think he's talking about user experience, like qualitative versus, you're right, ridership, it is 3rd behind those 2. So, again, we like to talk a lot about other systems around the world. How much do operations cover the fares? There's a couple of large Southeast Asian and East Asian cities there. You see Toronto is basically one of the highest in terms of fare box covering the majority of the operations. Now, the key to remember is that in East Asia, the transit operators end up becoming landlords. So they actually sell the rights above their stations. Something that we're actually going to be piloting on the Eglinton line. Metrolinx just announced a RFQ or I or P, whichever one of those it was, a few weeks ago. And so we're going to try to pilot this on top of 4 of the crosstown stations to kind of unlock some of the value of the land that's right next to it. So in terms of all these comparative cities, again, Toronto, we fund a lot of the system's operation from the fare bonds. So, well, you might be saying, well, the TTC wastes money. Well, no. From an efficiency perspective, this was commissioned by TransLink in Vancouver. We have the lowest costs in Canada per passenger. We have the most revenue passengers per hour, and we have the most revenue passengers per kilometer. Yeah, so it's a heavily used system. So is the TTC world-class? Well, we have citywide coverage all day, all night. So actually, let me just talk about a few of the maps. The red and slightly orange map on the top, the orange is the new services that will be added this year, or restored, I should say. Red are all the surface routes. The blue and purple are the overnight routes, so 24/7 routes. They'll have service all night long. You have the bottom right corner, so 10 minutes or better surface route service. So I can show up, I don't have to look at a schedule ever again. There will be a bus or a streetcar there in 10 minutes or less. And then you have the express route service, which some of the existing ones are in orange here, and the new ones will be added. So again, the TTC gets phone calls from even places like New York saying, how do you run such a high quality surface operation? They can't believe how many people, A, ride the surface network, and B, the type of coverage that we get, and C, that we can run less than 10-minute service on those networks. We have GPS tracking in all vehicles. So if you regular ride of the TTC, I never leave my house without kind of figuring out where the next vehicle is, and then I can choose alternate routes if need be. There's free transfers between surface and subway, which not all places have. London and New York and Washington have a different fare system for the surface and the subway. You pay again to ride another vehicle if you leave the subway system, and it's a different fare structure. It's a flat fare is another big thing. So you pay one fee to go across the entire city. We had integrated bus streetcar interchanges with the subway. So you don't need a transfer to transfer between a lot of these routes. They have the bus bays. We have a robust feeder system, and Wi-Fi is on its way. So how do we improve what we already have? So there's a guy by the name of Jarrett Walker, and I'd really encourage you to read his book. It's called Human Transit. It's all about kind of how we cater or change transit operations to be more customer-minded. But the real key to unlocking the power of transit and getting more riders that commit is the frequency of service and trip time reliability. Those are the two most important things. Fare does matter, but not as much as those two. If I know that my bus, if I miss one bus, I know when it's going to be there the next time. It's less than 10 minutes, which is really important. That completely changes my outlook. I never have to look at a schedule again. I just show up and I know a vehicle is going to be there. The second bit is trip time reliability. So if my trip takes half an hour one day and 65 minutes another day and 45 minutes another day, you really can't take that to work, right? And that's the biggest driver a lot of the time for ridership. The analogy I like to say is that imagine there was a garage door at the end of your driveway that only opened once every half an hour, because your bus only comes once every half an hour. Imagine you could only leave your driveway in your car once every half an hour. That's the same analogy, right? There's some people that have to take transit. So again, there's policy and service options that you can consider. So from a policy perspective, there's a lot that can be done with fares, but if we mess around with the fares, there's a technology limitation as well as it might require more subsidy. So can we integrate fares better between the TTC and GO Transit? Yeah, we probably really do need to do that, and I'm sure it's coming soon. Do we need to take into account discounts for low-income, senior, student people? Yes. Some other things that they do in other agencies are fares by transit mode. I just mentioned New York, London, and Washington. They have one fare structure for the subways. They have another fare structure for the surface routes, and you pay between them. In the case of London, England, they have a zone system, so it's fares by distance. We just announced free children's fares, so any child under the age of 12 can now ride the TTC for free. And the last thing is, sorry, yes?
I don't see one thing that is used in most European cities.
Sure.
Some Americans. 2.5 hours or something like this. Duration, regardless of where you go.
Sure, so that's not...
This means that the streetcar has 3 doors, people go in and out of 3 doors.
Yes.
In my case, sometimes the bus misses 2 lines.
Sure.
Because people go from inside.
Absolutely, and that's actually on my next slide. So I separate policy and service. The next thing is an off-peak discount. So if you could give everybody a $1 discount to travel before 7 a.m., you could buy yourself a whole ton of capacity in the main peak and rush. But to do that, you need some more technology and a little bit more of a complex structure. What about flexible hours? So why is there even a peak period or rush hour at all? It's because everybody has to be at work usually between 8 or 9 o'clock, and everybody has to leave work between 4 and 5 o'clock. So there is some talk between Metrolinx and some of the largest employers in the city for, can we start adopting a little bit more of a flexible hours policy? Because again, our network, both the roads and transit, are only over capacity a few hours per day. They're pretty critical hours, but that's also because of a result of everything else. Another thing that we can look at is land use and zoning. So I talked a little bit about the Places to Grow Act. Well, if there were employment regions and zones close to where we all worked, not just in Toronto where we have lots of that, then maybe there would be a lot of counterflow commuting. Maybe we wouldn't all be going downtown. And then finally, transit rights of way and signal priority. Again, something that we can only really do by, frankly, deprioritizing or reprioritizing what mode gets to go first, or what has the most easiest flow.
How much of that do we have now?
They're doing a little bit of it, but not a ton. Not a ton. There's a little bit on King, for example, and I'm not a huge expert in that area, but there's a bit of it. So what about service improvement options? So more vehicles. So let's just get more service vehicles out there. Well, that's a great idea, but we have a limitation in that every vehicle that can be in service in the morning and afternoon rush hours is in service. So we have to buy new buses and new streetcars. There is a lag time for that order, usually over a year, a couple of years in some cases. Not only that, all of our garage space is full too. So where are you going to clean them every night? Maybe they don't need repairs, but where are you going to clean the buses every night? So now they're looking at things like, okay, can we lease buses? Can we lease garage space? You know, what does York region or Durham region or Peel region have for us that we can kind of buy up a little bit to buy us some time? Another idea is shifting from a schedule-based system to a headway-based system. So right now, every single route is, you know, there's a bus at 11 past the hour, 25 past, I'm making this up on the spot, we'll say 47 past, and let's just say that's what it is, okay? A lot of systems move towards a headway-based system. So the difference is that there's going to be a transit vehicle at my stop every X minutes no matter what. So every 5 minutes, every 10, every 15. The problem is, in order to do that, you need really, really careful route and line management. Therefore, you need supervisors, which costs money, right? You need higher level management to do that. So there's a lot of solutions here, and I'm probably beating this drum too loud, but money is a big limiting factor. The size of the vehicles, right? So could we buy bigger vehicles? Well, that's where, for example, the new streetcar is going to buy us some of it. If you rode the Line 1 or Young University Spadina line, there's the TR trains. So that can buy us a little bit more capacity. As the gentleman mentioned, there's kind of two parts of all-door boarding and timed transfers. So all-door boarding will allow us to reduce the amount of time, it's called the dwell time, that it takes to load and unload at stations, right? Because right now with everybody, regardless of whether you have a Metro Pass or not, boarding at the front door, that really slows down how fast the bus can get moving. And small improvements in dwell time really improve the speed and reliability and quality of the service quite a bit. Now, a lot of systems move towards that, and they typically do it's called a POP system, or proof of payment. So now, it's no longer the driver's responsibility to make sure that you all paid. It's your own responsibility to make sure you have the right ticket, or have a valid ticket, and there'll be fare inspectors. So they'll be rolling that out across all the streetcars in the next year and a half or so. Time transfer, as the gentleman said, as opposed to right now where, yes, you have, I think it's 90 minutes or so to complete your trip. It has to be a continuous trip, so basically at connection points. Time transfers means that I have an unlimited pass to go as many different trips that I want to within that amount of time, and that's kind of the natural next step from a POP system. What we're moving towards kind of in the short term is this more off-peak service, more express buses, and more downtown direct service. So again, that can, we talked a little bit about how there's a lot of off-peak ridership, but The caveat is that some people don't ride off-peak because the service isn't as frequent and as often. So if we improve the off-peak service, you can get maybe a couple of percent, 3-4% maybe shift over and shift their hours of travel. The last thing is bunching and route management. That's probably one of the most, I guess, most complained about things today, the TTC, is that these vehicles end up kind of right next to each other. Is there nothing that we can do about it? Honestly, I try to think about a lot of different solutions to this myself. You know, can we put the car on drop-off only service in front so it can speed ahead, or do we slow the guy behind down on it, or when they catch up, does the first car politely ask everybody to move to the second car, go out of service, and rush ahead? I mean, there's a lot of solutions, but what might work, right? So this is something that they really struggle with and is tough. The TTC kind of does claim that traffic is a big problem in this case for this, but at the same time, a lot of cities around the world have traffic, and how do they address this problem? So that's probably a big one that we have to look at. And honestly, I don't have the magic bullet, but the next time you see bunching and you're cursing at it and you're probably tweeting about something, some of you, try to think about how you would solve that problem. It's not easy. The last thing is payment methods. So Presto is coming, for better or for worse, in the next couple of years. We just added credit card payments to the TTC. Something that's really not known very well is that those Presto readers do support NFC, which is Near Field Communication, which means that your Visa PayWave and MasterCard PayPass and your smartphones, the readers are built in to accept that technology. It's just when they get turned on. So again, we can speed all that up.
Regarding bunching, computer dispatching of that?
I might defer to Bob's expertise on that.
Yeah, the constant headway, GPS constant headway will be a big solution, especially in congested streets. It's not really so much the supervisors, but when you have congested streets, you can't keep to a schedule. It stresses the operator. That's why you get bunching. It means that you've got crowded vehicles and vehicles that are coasting or drafting, which are empty. And so if you have a constant headway on through GPS on congested streets, you'll have much better service, much better lower dwell times.
So the thing is that even with that in mind, the second vehicle would still have to slow down, right? So are you on the second vehicle? We all hate bunching, but are you willing to wait 5 minutes at one stop just to give the people ahead of you? I'm not sure we're there yet.
There was an article a couple months ago that they just added a couple of minutes to the schedule on the streetcars, and by doing that, they were able to eliminate a lot of the short-terming work where they were increasing. It made some percentage of increase or decrease.
Yeah, they did that on St. Clair, which is a right-of-way, and is that really solving the problem, or is that just making longer schedule? It's just making a longer run time so that they don't panic as much, right?
It's the honest schedule versus the optimistic schedule. I'll start releasing vehicles too soon.
Sure, but I don't know. I don't know if that's really a solution.
You don't really have an honest schedule when you have congested streets. You've got one service point that does 169 routes. So, and I've heard many operators tell me they pass on input to service planning and just ignore it. So, when you have fires, police investigations, accidents, cars blocking rails, the schedules go to the window as soon as they get over the route. So that's what they really have to adjust with, and that's what Andy and Chris are really fighting the culture of the TDC to go to a constant rate change. That's a massive change for the TDC. That is a solution.
So just, I'd like to talk, I guess. In a couple of slides, we'll take a break, give everybody a chance, and then we'll focus on, I guess, the lines drawing on a map.
Richie, did you prepare at all about the use of dedicated lanes for buses? Does that help, or it doesn't?
I mean, it absolutely helps, but I think the reason I frame all the financial and the reality is that to do that, you're going to take away a lane from cars.
Yep.
So is that really realistic? And there's that big push and pull. Maybe it'll happen, but I don't know. I don't have necessarily the faith in that right now. It's difficult. So again, we talked about the fleet. The graph on the left just kind of shows that the TTC is constantly buying new vehicles, but they do have a lifespan. The existing streetcars have been in service since late 70s, early 80s. So the fact that they are, I guess, going on 30, some of them 40 years old is astonishing. That's also why they don't work that great all the time, right? So we do have an order in. Bombardier seems like they're getting their act together. So we are hopefully getting new vehicles, I guess, more consistently now. So the idea on the right side is that there is a hierarchy again. We have normal buses. We have the kind of bendy articulated buses, the old streetcar, the new, the Scarborough RT trains, the Shepherd subway, the Bloor Danforth, and finally the TR trains on the Young Line. So I think these things are super cool. The new low-floor LRV TTC streetcars, they hold about 251 people, so that's 70 seating and 181 standing. That's about 3.5 times the capacity of a bus. Give you a bit of context. They're 30 meters long. There's no steps at all, so that will speed up boarding and unloading a lot. It's a proof of payment system, so it's also all-door boarding. It's a vehicle designed so that you don't move between the vehicle. You go into one of your pods and you kind of stay there. There are ticket machines on board, so you actually never interact with the driver. They're 100% wheelchair accessible. I mentioned this earlier. They have a 70 km/h max speed. So yes, they could get going. They're really never going to do that. Maybe not. Not even on Spadina. They're air conditioned and they have heating. And they're nice and quiet. And so there is a tentative rollout schedule. I think this was redone recently, because this is from a Toronto Star article in the fall. So we'll probably get it on Bathurst and Harbourfront. Actually, we're in 2015 now, aren't we? Never mind. We're
Service on the Queen City line, I think.
What's that?
Some of them are already in service, aren't they?
Yeah, so Spadina, because Spadina loops from Union, some of them are there. So the thing is that Bombardier, I believe, is committed to 2 a month, starting in April or May, which should ramp up to 4 per month by June, and we have 205 of these coming over the next 5 years, with an order for another 60 that we basically need to happen, but it's not approved yet. So the last thing is about the subway. I know I talk a lot about the surface routes, but automatic train control. So right now, on every TTC subway train, you have a driver at the front, and you have a guy in the middle, whose name, I don't know the official title, but essentially they check the platform, they open and close the doors, they're kind of in the middle so they can see both ways. Guard, thank you. Now, the existing signal system is the existing signaling system that was installed on the Yonge subway in the late 50s and early 60s. Same thing on Bloor Danforth line. It should have been upgraded 15 plus years ago. So when you again say that there's a signal problem at Station X on the Yonge line, it's not really the TTC's fault that we didn't fund them to do these repairs 15 years ago. It's kind of our fault. They're upgrading to an automatic train control system. What this means is that instead of there being required to be a fixed amount of track segments between adjacent trains, the trains will be on autopilot, and they'll take into account the relative speed and position of all trains on the line, and they'll basically get as close together as possible for a safe stopping distance. So right now on the Yonge line, you can get trains down to about 2.5-ish minutes between each other, maybe 3. This allows you to get closer to 100 seconds between trains, or 110 seconds. So that adds maybe, let's say, this is highly disputed, but we'll say between 10 and 30% capacity to the Yonge line. Problem is, again, it's taking a long time. This won't be operational for another 2 or 3 or maybe 4 years at this point.
Don't you need more trains for that?
So they do have enough extra trains for that. Actually, I'm pretty sure they do have extra trains for that. Do they have enough TR trains for this?
They do. They're going to put all the rockets on Young, and they'll put T1s on Bloor.
Now the key here is, though, that you could actually theoretically get faster than that, but the station configurations is a limiting factor. Because we only have one-sided boarding, and frankly it's all Bloor-Young basically, is that the amount of time it takes, just stand there in rush hour, the amount of time it takes to get people off the trains and then back on you probably have realized that they're starting to close the doors before everybody's even on. They're trying to get this going because until you get Bloor-Young sped up, there's nothing you can do about getting it faster than that. So in theory, automatic train control has been, you can see that in some other cities, you can getting down to like below 100 seconds and even 90. It's really not realistic in Toronto unless we spend a lot of money to upgrade the stations. The last major piece is the AODA requirements, which the province legislated a few years ago. Every public building and service is required and mandated, or there's a rolling set of deadlines. The TTC is supposed to be, the entire system is supposed to be accessible for those with mobility issues at least by 2024, I believe. You know, we talk a lot about how our TTC system is very limited. That's what it looks like if you can't use a staircase or an escalator. Okay, so we do definitely need to do a lot more there, and you know, all the buses now, they're accessible. All the new streetcars will be accessible, but the big cost is putting elevators in every single subway station. So that is something that's coming, and we really don't have a way to pay for it. The last piece about operations we'll talk about is the GO Transit network. So you have the 7 train lines and the bus network as a whole. Just to give you an idea in context, these are the volumes of GO Transit versus the streetcar lines. And the small picture on the right shows you the GO Transit passengers relative to the Young Line and Bloor-Danforth line. So it is dwarfed by an order of magnitude compared to the ridership on the subway. So Lakeshore West and East get between 50 and 60,000 riders per day, which is about the same as the King and Spadina streetcars. Everything else is a lot less. So how are we going to improve this? The real big game changer for our generation is, in my opinion, is the GO electrification plan. So they have a plan to electrify all 7 GO lines from Toronto all the way out to the edges. That will allow them to run quieter and cleaner trains, but also more frequent. So this is a really big deal. It's a huge project. But the idea is that if they can run less than 15-minute service on every one of those GO lines in the entire region all day, every day, or even less than 30-minute service, that is a huge change for how we move about. You know, we think we have it bad in Toronto for traffic, but the suburbs have it way worse because they end up getting funneled onto this very little infrastructure, and transit isn't that great there. And there are some limitations that we have to work with the federal government on in terms of railway regulations. So that is going to be a limitation, as well as Union Station. So Union is undergoing a massive facelift. I have a couple of kind of 3D images here for you. While the passenger side will be nice and upgraded in the next, I think they'll open fully late 2016, which I guess probably means 2018. I joke around, but it's pretty hard to wear plastics like this. The problem is the rail side. So there's a finite number of tracks that go in. Federal regulations mean that you can only have trains through and adjacent to each other a lot farther apart than rapid transit. So we have to think about that side. They are updating the signaling infrastructure, but you know, there's a lot to be talked about there, because right now the regulations state that if a train is going to stop at Union and go out, there has to be 15 minutes in between them. So you can't really run this increased service to do that, because there's actually not enough platforms for that many trains to be arriving. Second to that, you can't even clear a platform if 1,500 people arrive on a GO train in less than 5 to 10 minutes, right? So again, this all comes into account. I talked way too long. I think we all deserve a break. So we want to take maybe a 10-minute break, and I'll start again at 8:30. And for those of you who, I guess, are unable to stay for a little bit longer, the second half is shorter. But if you want to grab my business card, I can send you some of the slides, or we can talk later if you'd like. The second half is on capital and new lines. So thank you so far.
Richie, I would say this is probably one of the most entertaining presentations I've had in the 18 years I've been covering transit.
Thank you.